He left home to bury his grief in boardrooms, but when he returned unannounced, everything had changed. Laughter echoed down the halls that were once tombs of silence. His twin sons, laughing, screaming, alive, and at the center of it all, not a doctor, not a therapist, the maid. He wasn't sure if he'd walked into a dream, or if he was finally waking up from one. What happened in that kitchen would shatter everything he thought he knew about grief, about healing, about what really saves a family. The Ross mansion hadn't heard laughter in 287 days, not since the crash, not since Rachel. Since then, joy had been boxed up, smiles replaced by silence. The twins, Eric and Evan, moved through each day like shadows. Edward Ross did what any man drowning in sorrow and success would do. He left the house, left the mess, left his boys in the hands of strangers until they all quit. But someone stayed. Not the nanny, not the counselor, a cleaner, hired to wipe floors, not tears. 2 weeks in, Tracy Miller had barely said 5 words to Edward. But on that Tuesday morning, she said something else. Not with her mouth, with a spoon, with one reckless flick of whipped cream. She cracked the silence wide open. And what came pouring out wasn't just laughter. It was something Edward never expected to hear again. Hope. And what happened next was something no one saw coming. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story reminds you, healing doesn't always wear a name tag. Sometimes it walks in quietly with a mop in its hand and changes everything. The Ross mansion woke up in silence, like it always did. Sunlight streamed through spotless glass windows, catching dust that had nowhere to settle. Floors gleamed. The air was still. No music, no footsteps, just the quiet hum of a refrigerator and the faint ticking of a clock that felt far too loud. Tracy Miller stepped inside the kitchen like she always did, quietly, quickly, without ceremony. She wasn't there to be seen. That was the rule. She kept her eyes low, tied her yellow gloves, and moved toward the sink. Eric and Evan sat at the kitchen island, legs swinging, but no life in them. Their cereal bowls were untouched, spoons resting like tiny flags of surrender. They didn't speak. They never did. Tracy glanced at them once, then looked away. She'd only been here 2 weeks. Hired through an agency. Part-time. No expectations. She cleaned the marble countertops. She scrubbed the tile grout. She wasn't supposed to talk to the twins, but that morning something felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just off. Maybe it was Evan's shoulders, slumped a little deeper. Maybe it was the way Eric kept spinning his spoon without looking up, or maybe it was the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't just sit in a room. It swallows it whole. And Tracy, she wasn't good at keeping still, so she reached over slowly, dipping her finger into a bowl of whipped cream, and in one soft flick landed it right on Evan's nose. He didn't blink, he didn't speak. He just stared at her. Tracy froze. Her
Too
breath
far,
caught. She thought. You're not their mother. You're not even supposed to be here. But then Evan's eyes crossed slightly, trying to see the cream. A small sound cracked the stillness. A snort, a hiccup, something between a giggle and a gasp. Eric looked up. He blinked once and then, without warning, catapulted a grape across the counter. It hit Tracy's apron with a soft thwap. She stared at it, then at him. "Oh," she said, voice trembling with surprise. "So it's like that now?" The boys looked at her, waiting to be scolded, to be told enough, like always. But Tracy smiled, not wide, not loud, just enough. She dipped her hand into the bowl of strawberries and flicked one back at Eric. And that's when it happened. Laughter. Real, loud, unfiltered. Evan shrieked and ducked under the table. Eric jumped to his feet, arms flailing, joy erupting like a dam had broken. Pancakes flew, whipped cream splattered. Tracy tried to keep up, but part of her didn't want to. She let herself go. For the first time since walking into this house, she stopped trying to be invisible. She joined them. Upstairs, Edward Ross tightened his watch strap. A cancelled board meeting had freed up his morning. He hadn't told anyone, he wasn't ready to see them. He just wanted coffee. But as he stepped into the hall, he heard it. Laughter. He stopped cold. He hadn't heard that sound in almost a year. And for a moment he thought maybe, no, it couldn't be. Edward didn't say a word. He stood in the doorway like someone who'd taken a wrong turn in his own home. The kitchen, once sterile and silent, now looked like a battleground of joy. There were waffles on the floor, fruit on the ceiling, whipped cream smeared like war paint across both boys' cheeks, and at the center of it all, Tracy Miller, breathless, laughing. Her apron was soaked, her braid had come loose, there was a strawberry stuck to her sock. And for the first time since Rachel's funeral, his sons looked alive, not just functioning, not just fed, laughing, whole, messy, human. Evan stood on a chair waving a fork like a flag. Eric ducked under the counter, his giggles bouncing off the tiles. Tracy turned toward the doorway, and that's when she saw him. Her body tensed in an instant. The smile disappeared like a switch had been flipped. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Edward's jaw tightened. 1,000 thoughts flashed across his face. Shock, confusion, something else he couldn't name. For a long second, no one moved. Then Eric peeked out from behind the kitchen island, holding a strawberry in one hand and a foam dinosaur in the other. He looked at Tracy, then at his father, then said quietly, "We didn't break anything." Tracy finally found her voice. "I'll clean it up right now." Edward nodded once. Not angry, not approving, just unreadable. He turned and walked out without another word. Upstairs, Edward poured himself black coffee he wouldn't finish. He stood by the window of his study, watching the garden below, overgrown, faded. Rachel used to spend hours out there. It was wild now, like everything else. The sound of laughter still echoed faintly from below. It tugged at something in him. Something painful, something unfamiliar. He hated how unfamiliar it felt. Back in the kitchen, the boys were helping Tracy wipe down the cabinets with wet paper towels. They didn't speak, but they hummed, a tune she didn't recognize but followed anyway. Evan climbed onto the stool beside her and handed her a dish rag like it was a prize. "Miss Tracy," he said quietly. She looked over, startled by how serious his voice sounded. "You're like sunshine," he whispered. Her throat tightened. Then, just as quickly, Evan giggled and ran to chase his brother down the hall. Tracy stood there a moment longer, the rag still in her hands, heart full of something she didn't quite understand. That night, Edward sat in his office, the lights off, the fire low. A family photo sat on his desk, Rachel with the twins, laughing, blurry in motion. He ran his thumb across her face, and then he heard it again. Laughter, fainter now. Upstairs, a child's squeal, the sound of bare feet down a hallway. He closed his eyes. The ache in his chest wasn't grief exactly. It was something more dangerous. Hope, and he wasn't sure what to do with that. Not yet. Edward didn't sleep. He told himself it was the emails, the quarterly reports, the investor pitch waiting in his inbox. But it wasn't. It was the sound of joy still echoing through his house, the kind that didn't belong here anymore. He got up just after 5, showered, shaved. By 7 he was standing in the kitchen, waiting, watching, as Tracy stepped in with her usual quiet presence and yellow gloves tucked into her apron. She didn't notice him at first. She was humming again, that same tune, light, aimless, full of something he'd forgotten how to name. The boys weren't up yet, just the two of them. Tracy reached for the sponge by the sink. "We need to talk," Edward said. She jumped slightly, hand tightening around the sponge. "Of course," she said quickly. "About the mess yesterday. I didn't mean—" "You're the maid," he interrupted. He didn't say it cruelly, just flat, final, like a reminder he needed to hear himself say out loud. "That scene yesterday, it wasn't your role." Tracy turned slowly. Her face was calm, unreadable, but something shifted behind her eyes. She waited a moment before answering. No child ever smiled because the floors were spotless. Her voice was gentle but steady. Edward's jaw clenched. He looked away. "It's not about smiling," he said. "It's about boundaries." "Then maybe that's the problem," she replied. The silence that followed wasn't sharp, it was slow, heavy with things neither of them wanted to say out loud. Edward nodded once. "Just keep things appropriate," he said. Tracy didn't respond. She picked up the sponge, turned back to the sink. The hum didn't return. That afternoon, Tracy stayed quieter than usual. No flicks of whipped cream, no dancing between chores. She folded towels with careful corners, dried spoons like glass. The boys noticed. "Are you sad?" Evan asked as she folded a blanket near the couch. "No," Tracy said softly. "Just a little quiet today." Eric frowned. "Did we do something wrong?" That question nearly broke her. "No, sweetheart. Not you." She tucked the blanket tighter than it needed to be, and tried not to look at the top of the stairs where she knew he sometimes stood, watching, listening. That night, after bedtime, the twins called for her. Not the new sitter. Not the nanny on the schedule. "Miss Tracy," Evan whispered from under the covers, "will you stay for one story?" Just one. She hesitated at their door, then nodded. She sat cross-legged on the floor between their beds and read an old storybook they'd pulled from a dusty shelf. Eric reached for her hand halfway through. She let him. When the story ended, she didn't say goodnight right away. She just sat there. The sound of breathing, the warmth of two small hands. She wasn't supposed to be here, but here she was. From the hallway, Edward watched. He didn't move, just leaned against the wall, arms crossed, heart unsure. Tracy never looked up, but she knew. She felt it. The tension, the pull, the quiet truth that had settled in the house like dust. She was starting to matter, to them, and that scared all of them more than they'd ever admit. It had been Rachel's favorite place, the backyard, not the patio, not the lawn chairs that still sat folded by the shed, the garden, wild roses, honeysuckle, sunflowers that once reached taller than Edward's head. Now it was just overgrowth and silence. Dead leaves blanketed the beds, vines tangled through rusted trellises. No one had stepped foot out there in months, until Tracy opened the sliding glass door and let the boys run. "Do flowers still grow even if no one takes care of them?" Evan asked, crouched in the dirt with his fingers in the soil. "Some do," Tracy said gently. "The stubborn ones. The brave ones." Eric was already digging, his plastic spoon serving as a shovel. Tracy knelt beside them, knees in the dirt, sleeves rolled up. "What about this one?" Eric asked, pointing to a sprouting weed with a single white bloom. "Even weeds bloom," she whispered. Edward stood at the upstairs window, arms crossed, watching them. From this angle, it could have been Rachel down there. Hair messy, sleeves up, laughter rising in waves. The boys chasing butterflies between footprints and roots. But it wasn't Rachel. It was Tracy, and that made it harder. He didn't know what to do with that feeling. The ache, the guilt, the awe, all braided together, choking him. "Let's name him," Evan yelled, pointing at a butterfly that hovered just above Tracy's shoulder. "Captain Fluff," Eric announced. "Perfect," Tracy laughed. "Captain Fluff it is." She let the boys lead her around the garden like it was an adventure, not a graveyard. They collected stones, dug holes, talked to worms, and slowly, something shifted. The sun warmed their skin, their cheeks flushed with color. Life. That night, Edward lingered in the hallway again. He hadn't spoken to her since the kitchen, but she'd stayed, and they kept choosing her. He heard the way they said her name now. Miss Tracy. Like it meant more than it used to. Like it meant safe. Tracy washed her hands slowly at the sink, the scent of soil still on her skin. The sliding door was still ajar, letting in the evening breeze. Behind her, Edward stepped into the kitchen. She didn't turn around. Neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't angry, it just held too much. Finally, Tracy glanced over her shoulder. "The boys planted sunflower seeds," she said softly. "They said they wanted to make the garden happy again." Edward's eyes dropped to the floor. He nodded once. Rachel loved sunflowers. "I know." She dried her hands on her apron. "You don't have to say it," she added. Edward looked up, unsure. "What?" "That I crossed a line," she said, voice even. "That this wasn't my place." Edward exhaled slowly. But he didn't say it. He just looked at her, eyes soft. And for the first time, Tracy saw hesitation where there used to be distance. That small, quiet moment hung between them, like something trying to bloom, but not yet, not fully. Upstairs, the boys were already asleep, dirt still under their fingernails, smiles still clinging to their faces, and outside, the first sunflower seed lay beneath the earth, waiting. The storm rolled in just after sunset, one of those late spring downpours that doesn't knock. It crashes. Thunder cracked the sky in half, rain slammed against the windows like fists, and somewhere upstairs, a small voice broke through the darkness. "Tracy!" She was already moving. Down the hall, barefoot, braid damp from the garden. She found Evan curled in the corner of his bed, hands pressed to his ears. Eric was wide-eyed, frozen beneath the covers. The lights flickered once, then again. Tracy didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the bed and pulled them both close, arms wrapped around their trembling shoulders like she'd done it 100 times. "Shh," she whispered, brushing hair from Evan's damp forehead. "I'm here. You're safe. I've got you." She didn't tell them to be brave. She didn't promise the storm would pass quickly. She just stayed. Edward had heard the cry too. He had risen from his desk on instinct, one hand still holding the whiskey glass he hadn't touched. He was halfway down the hallway when he stopped, and saw her through the sliver of light coming from the boys' room. Tracy sitting cross-legged on the bed, cradling his sons like they were her own. Evan's tiny hands gripping the fabric of her shirt. Eric's head tucked beneath her chin. And Tracy, rocking gently, humming that same lullaby she always seemed to carry inside her. The melody wasn't perfect, but it was familiar. Edward stood in the doorway, unseen, uninvited, unnecessary. Something broke in him then, a truth he'd been trying to outrun. They didn't call for him. They hadn't in a long time. He had left the house but never noticed the part of him that had gone missing with it. Now it was there, in that room, in her arms. Tracy looked up, just slightly. She hadn't heard him, but she felt him, the weight of his presence in the doorway. She didn't speak, didn't move, but something in her face softened, a small recognition, a quiet ache. He stood there a moment longer, then turned away, not in anger, not in judgment, just unsure where he belonged. Back in his study, the storm pressed harder against the windows. Lightning lit the room in flashes. Edward stood in the dark, looking out into the garden. The sunflower seeds were still buried beneath the soil, but they were there. He thought about Evan's voice calling her name, the way the boys curled into Tracy like she was shelter, the way she didn't flinch. She showed up, when he hadn't, not because she had to, but because she chose to. And somewhere deep in his chest, the storm found its way in, not loud, not destructive, just honest. Upstairs, the boys slept with their heads resting on her lap. The thunder faded, but something else had cracked, quietly, inside them all. It was taped to the fridge, crooked, colored in with crayon and something that looked like jam on the corner. Edward didn't notice it at first. He'd come in for coffee. Early. The boys were still upstairs. Tracy hadn't arrived yet. The kitchen was still almost back to what it used to be. Almost. Then he saw it. A piece of paper, a child's drawing, 4 stick figures, 2 small, 1 tall in a blue triangle dress, and 1 in a black suit and square shoes. Floating above them, another figure, angel wings, yellow hair, a halo scribbled with the wrong end of an orange crayon, and at the top, in uneven handwriting, "Mommy watching us smile." Edward didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there, coffee forgotten, hand hovering above the pot, staring at a picture drawn by someone who couldn't spell smile, but somehow knew everything. Tracy stepped in quietly behind him, not realizing he was there. She froze when she saw him. "I didn't—" He didn't turn around. "They drew this?" His voice was quiet, controlled, but not cold. "Evan did the people, Eric did the sun and the wings," she said. Tracy stepped closer, her voice soft. "They asked if they could hang it up. I didn't think—" "No, it's fine." He stared at the drawing like it might change if he looked long enough. "They put you in it." A statement, not a question. "They see you as one of us," he added. Tracy didn't speak. She stood beside him now, close enough to feel the space between them stretch and tremble. "I don't know how to feel about that," Edward said finally. She looked at him, really looked, and when she spoke it wasn't defensive, it wasn't proud, just honest. Children draw what they feel, not what they're told. Edward turned to her, and for the first time in a long time, he looked lost. "They barely speak to me anymore," he said. There was no accusation in his voice, no resentment, just a man realizing how far he'd drifted from his own children. "They used to run to me," he whispered. Tracy opened her mouth, then closed it again. Some things didn't need answers, some grief wasn't looking to be solved, just witnessed. "I didn't come here to replace her," she said after a moment. "I know. I didn't even mean to stay this long." Edward's eyes dropped to the drawing again. His boys, smiling. A woman in a blue dress holding their hands, Rachel floating above them, and him, still standing off to the side. Not alone, just not quite there. "I should go start the laundry," Tracy said gently. He nodded. She walked away. Her footsteps were light, almost careful. Edward stayed where he was. The coffee had gone cold, but he hadn't noticed. He was still holding the drawing in his hands, like it might tear if he breathed too hard. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the old kind of quiet, the cold, hollow kind. This quiet felt heavy, like something sacred was passing through. Rachel Ross would have turned 36 today. There was no party, no flowers, no framed photo on the counter with a candle next to it, just the weight of her name, suspended in every room. Edward left early, like he always did on her birthday. Boardroom, elevator, flight to nowhere. He told his assistant to block the day. He told himself it was just easier. But back in the kitchen, the boys remembered. Of course they did. Children don't forget love, even when they're too young to name it. "Can we make her a cake?" Evan whispered. Tracy paused mid-swipe of the countertop. "For Mommy?" Evan nodded. Eric climbed onto the stool beside him. "Just a little one." "With jelly beans," Evan added, "and chocolate sprinkles." Tracy didn't say yes. She just opened the pantry and started gathering ingredients. The boys tied towels around their waists like aprons. They cracked eggs too hard, spilled flour like snow, and licked the spoons when they thought she wasn't looking. The kitchen was a mess, but this time no one cared. When the cake came out of the oven, the boys decorated it with their small, sticky hands. Tracy lit a single candle. No singing, no speeches. Just 3 people standing around a cake made for someone they all missed in different ways. "Make a wish," Tracy whispered. "Do you think she'll hear us?" Evan asked. "I think—" "She hears what matters," Tracy said. Evan looked at Eric. "You go first." Eric leaned forward, eyes closed, whispered something no one heard. Then Evan. He didn't whisper. "I wish Mommy sees us laughing again." Tracy blinked fast, then gently nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's blow it together." 3 breaths, 1 flame, and silence. Not the empty kind. The sacred kind. Edward opened the front door just before 9. He was still in his coat. The house was dark except for the kitchen. He stopped at the threshold, and something in him paused. The three of them sat on the floor. The cake was between them. One candle melted into frosting. Evan leaned against Tracy's shoulder. Eric rested his head on her lap. Tracy wasn't speaking. She was just there, still, present, holding space where a mother used to be. Edward couldn't move. His eyes stung before he even knew why. Not just because of Rachel, but because his sons had found a way to grieve and celebrate at the same time, without him. He stepped into the light. Tracy looked up, startled, then softened. Evan turned, sleepy-eyed. "We saved you a slice," he said. Edward didn't speak. He just sat down beside them, on the cold tile floor, in the middle of the mess, in the company of the only people who still said her name out loud. And finally, he let himself cry. Not because he was weak, but because something in him had been silent too long. And tonight, even silence had found its voice. The house was asleep. Upstairs, the boys were tangled in blankets, cheeks still sticky with jelly bean frosting. The candle was gone. The cake was half-eaten. The kitchen light buzzed softly, and Edward stood at the edge of the room watching Tracy rinse dishes at the sink. She didn't know he was there, or maybe she did. She moved slower than usual, like she was waiting. "They needed today," he said quietly. Tracy turned. No smile, just eyes that had seen enough to know when something mattered. "So did you," she replied. Edward nodded. He stepped forward, then leaned against the counter, close but careful. "I didn't know how to do it," he said. "Do what?" "Grieve in front of them." His voice didn't crack, but it carried a weight that said it almost did. "I thought if I kept going, if I just held everything together, it would get easier." "Did it?" "No." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was human, and somehow safe. "I've just been showing up," Tracy said softly. "That's all I had. I didn't know what else to do." Edward looked at her for a long time. He saw it now, the exhaustion, the patience, the quiet ache beneath her steadiness. "They call you Mama Tracy," he said. She froze. His voice didn't carry judgment, just truth. "Evan said it yesterday," he added. Eric nodded like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Tracy blinked, then looked away. "I never tried to replace her." "I know. I love them like they're mine," she said, voice trembling now. "But I know they're not." "That's what makes you exactly who they need." Tracy looked up, and for the first time in a long time, Edward didn't seem tired, just present. "When Rachel died," he said, "everything stopped. I didn't know how to be a father without her. She was the one who danced in the kitchen, who made up lullabies, who filled the silence." Tracy nodded, slowly. "And you filled it with work," she said. He didn't deny it. "I didn't think anyone could reach them," he admitted, "until you threw mashed potatoes at one of them." That made her laugh, soft and a little broken. "I didn't plan that," she said. "Good," he smiled, "the kind that takes effort when you've forgotten how." "You're not the help," Edward said finally. The words landed gently. "You're not temporary. You're part of this." Tracy didn't speak. Her throat was too tight. Her hands still smelled like dish soap and birthday cake. "I don't know what this is," he added. "I just know the house feels different when you're in it." Another silence. But this one didn't hurt. It held something new. Not quite a beginning, but the willingness to begin. Upstairs, the boys stirred in their sleep. A soft murmur, a shifting blanket. Tracy wiped her hands on her apron. Edward stepped aside, letting her pass. But before she reached the door, she paused. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" She looked back at him. "For staying tonight." And then she was gone, leaving him in the kitchen, standing in the place where grief had once ruled, now filled with something else, something that sounded a lot like peace, but not quite, not yet. The morning light reached the kitchen before anyone else did. It touched the countertops, danced on the flour stains no one wiped up, and caught the edge of a drawing still taped to the fridge. Edward stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, watching it all like it was the first time. The house wasn't perfect. The garden was still half wild. There were fingerprints on the windows, toys in the hallway, laughter rising from the living room, no longer hushed, and for once, he didn't want to fix any of it. Tracy was already in the kitchen. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her hair pulled into a loose knot, flour on her cheek. "We're making cupcakes," she said. "I can see that," he smiled. Evan had frosting on his forehead. Eric was eating straight from the bowl. Edward walked over and dipped a finger into the icing. "That's against the rules," Tracy teased. "I'm not very good at rules," he replied. "You're also really bad at cupcakes," she added, pointing to the glob he smeared unevenly across Evan's nose. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm learning from the best." Tracy laughed. Not the polite kind. The kind that came from deep inside. The kind she hadn't let herself feel in months. "Daddy!" Eric shouted suddenly. "You forgot the sprinkles!" Edward grabbed the container and handed it over. "You're the sprinkle captain now," he said. Evan reached up and tugged on Tracy's sleeve. "We're a team now," he whispered. "Mommy would love that." Tracy looked at him, eyes soft,
"Yeah," she
throat
said.
tight. "I think she would." There was no ceremony, no grand declaration, just a man in a kitchen, making a mess with his sons, and a woman beside him who never meant to stay, but did. Not because it was easy, but because they needed someone to show up. Again, and again, and again. Later that day, Edward found Tracy alone in the garden. The sunflowers had started to peek through the soil. Tiny, fragile, alive. She knelt beside them, brushing dirt from a crooked stem. "They're coming up," she said, not turning. "So are we," he replied. She looked at him then, really looked, and something passed between them, not romance, not certainty, just the quiet agreement of two people who had survived something and decided to stay. That evening they sat on the back steps with the boys between them, watching Captain Fluff, the butterfly, circle above the garden. Eric leaned on Tracy's arm. Evan crawled into his father's lap, and for once there was nothing left to fix. The mansion hadn't changed overnight, but something had. The silence was gone. In its place, warmth. The mess was still there, but now it was full of life. The grief was still there too, but it wasn't empty anymore. It had been filled with laughter and loss and healing, with whipped cream and muddy shoes and lullabies sung off key, and love, the kind that doesn't show up loud, just true. Because when the world walked out, she walked in, not to save them, just to be there. And that made all the difference.